Today we're going to be replacing the thermal pads on the Aorus Radeon 6800 XT. We've been having a little bit of overheating issues with it, and to do that job we're going to need the following. We're going to need a Phillips screwdriver with a slightly finer tip, needle nose pliers, and some thermal compound. I'm using Arctic Silver 5, and of course you're also going to need some replacement thermal pads. I'm using THERMALRIGHT, and they're 1mm and 2mm. I'm not sure what's inside yet until I break this open, but I bought two just different sizes just in case. So these are what those are, and bear with me, we'll get right into it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is lay this thing down carefully to expose the back area. There's a whole bunch of little screws back here. You're going to use your Phillips screwdriver, and you're going to remove this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, these four, and then these two. Typically, I like to lay my screws out in the order in which they came out of the back plate here, and that way I don't confuse which holes they go into. Now these four screws that they'll have like a little springy type thing on them. They shouldn't be able to come off, but if yours do, just don't lose the spring. And then we're almost to the point where we can remove our back plate. We have one more screw. Once we remove the back plate, we should be able to see the thermal pads, I'm guessing. I haven't actually opened this up yet, so let's see here. That's a little sticky. I think it's because there's thermal paste on the GPU itself. I'm just trying to find the best place to kind of wiggle it a little bit. I don't want to force it. Oh, there it gave. I felt it give loose. Now underneath here, if I get my hands over the way, there's a couple of cables that we're going to have to deal with. There's one over there, and there's two right here. And I'm going to get the camera to give us a better angle. Okay, so we should be able to see that the little LCD screen cables are connected to the circuitry. We could use the needle nose pliers to kind of help us. We got to be real careful not to break the connectors, but we can use those needle nose pliers to kind of help us get those disconnected. There's another one down there that we have to get rid of, and I'm thinking that's the fan, probably most likely the fan controller. And then in here there was some thermal paste on the GPU. We're going to clean that up the best we can, and we will reapply thermal paste with the Arctic Silver 5. So before we disconnect some stuff, I want to see where those thermal pads are, and I think they're, yep, there they are, just right there. Those gray strips that look like they have indentations on them, they are what we're going to be replacing. So we're going to have to disconnect this and clean those off of there and reapply. I went ahead and flipped the graphics card upside down, and it's just going to give me better access to the fan control cable, and we'll disconnect that first, and it should make getting those other two down there a lot easier. I don't think I'll even use pliers for this. I'm just going to lightly grab this and kind of wiggle it back and forth carefully while I'm pulling pressure, and it should disconnect like that. And now we can lay this down carefully, and we should have better access to those guys there, and they're kind of in there the same way. We're just going to take our time and do it right. Now I've already went ahead and loosened these connectors. They are very stiff and they're hard to get out. The best recommendation I can give you is to take maybe a flat tip screwdriver, kind of put it under the edge of this deal here, use your other finger and kind of wiggle it out till it comes out of its slot. That's a 4-pin. Same thing with this guy, it's pretty stiff. I did the same thing, I just kind of wiggled it back and forth and it came out. Be careful, because if you wiggle too much side to side, these things they can break. I actually took a small little piece off of there, if you can see. It's not going to hurt it really that bad, but I don't like breaking things, so that's kind of irritating. But yeah, it just barely took this side off here. It'll still go back in and be fine, but it's one of those things you really want to be careful when you're doing. But once it's disconnected, then of course your heat sink, you can pretty much remove the card out of the picture, and then you'll have your heat sink that you can work with. Now that everything's been disconnected, we can focus on trying to clean up the thermal pads. We're actually going to scrape these off the best we can, and then we're going to kind of use these as templates for our new ones. They look to be an exact size. They're probably an exact size for a reason. They have to cover all of the chips that are on the graphics card. You're going to have all of these chips, gray and black, right in here. Sorry, the lighting's terrible. And you're going to have those in the main GPU, and then this set here, that are all going to need to have a thermal pad running across them. And so we're just going to kind of get an idea how big these are, and we'll have to measure out these and use those measurements to more or less use these or these to replace them. For the purpose of the repair, I chose to use this ThermalRight, and it is a low temperature, high performance, extreme Odyssey thermal pad, 1mm, and of course there's their website. With this, I've noticed this is the 1mm pad, and I pulled it out of the box already. Looks like this. Basically, we've got a thermal pad on one side, blue stuff on the other. You're pretty much going to peel it and stick it, but before you do that, you still have to measure the thermal pads that are already in place. So I didn't scrape this off yet, but the thickness of the 1mm pad, if you put it right up next to what's already there, you can see that they're pretty flush. I mean, they're really close. So those ones look to be 1mm. The one here, and I do believe that skinny one there is the same. And then it almost looks like these ones here are a little bit thicker, and I'm going to use the 2mm pads for those. And of course we're going to repaste where the GPU was after we clean that off and all that. But I would use 2mm for this, and for that. And then for these and these, I would use 1mm, also 1mm for these and these. And a few more tools that you might need that I forgot to mention is we're going to need a Sharpie marker to help us mark the measurements on the thermal pads, and then you're going to want a pair of really good and sharp scissors to cut those thermal pads. And if you're a perfectionist, you'll probably want to actually take measurements, and the tape measure may come in handy for that. So with further ado, here we go. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to check is the measurement for the first thermal pad that I'm going to start with here. And we're just going to kind of get right up there and get a kind of close measurement here. It looks like first one's going to be about 2 1/8 inches. I mean, if you went just a little longer, I don't think it's going to hurt, but if you actually put the tape measure, it's hard to get this bigger one right up there, but and like 2 1/8 roughly, give or take. so I'm gonna go 2 1/8 on that other pad, and we'll mark that. And those things only look like they're, what are they? About a 1/4 inch from one side to the other. So we're gonna make that measurement on our thermal pad that's right here, and I'm gonna use my Sharpie to mark it. And we'll basically put a mark on here, and we'll cut that strip out, and then we'll apply it to that, so to this one here. All right, I'll be back with you as soon as I make my measurements, and then we'll cut it out and put it on. So as you can see, I've marked my thermal pad with a Sharpie marker in 4 different places. I'm going to take the edge of the box, I think, maybe, and use it as a straight edge to draw a straight line to kind of guide my scissors more or less to do this. But yeah, I'm just going to draw a line there, and then cut that strip out. And I'm going to make 2 of them because I know that up here there's one basically right here, and then there's this guy right here, and I'm just going to make 2 lengths of that at quarter inch wide. So hang tight. As you can see here, the thermal pad here is shorter than the thermal pad here. The height of the thermal pad as it comes from the manufacturer is exactly the same height here, almost. It's pretty close. That we won't have to cut it. But for this guy, clearly we're gonna have to cut it. So I've cut this thermal pad for the first one, and it's covered with a plastic coating right here that you have to kind of peel off, and it's kind of, I gotta have fingernails, but basically it's kind of like a sticker. It has basically that, and the other side has this blue stuff, and it also peels off. But what I typically do is I'll peel off the blue stuff first. It's easier to get usually, and we'll just peel it. Oops, almost had it. We'll just peel it off, and you'll notice it's kind of maybe textured. But once you peel that off, you can kind of stick it onto the area that you want, and then leave the plastic there for a minute to protect it. I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So I'm just going to basically take that thermal pad with the textured stuff, and we're going to put it face down in the area where we want to replace our old thermal pad. So, whoops, just try to get it just right. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and kind of make sure it's sticking good. Oops, I might have it. Hang on a second. I had to peel it off there. I didn't have it as straight as I want, and I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, but let's see here. There's that. Perfect. Oops, there we go. Alright, so there's our first one. There's a plastic coating on this to keep it protected for now. I'm going to go ahead and replace all of the thermal pads, and then I'll peel each of the plastic strips up before I put my card back together. As you can see, I've already replaced the outer thermal pads on this heatsink with the 1mm pads. And one thing I wanted to kind of tell you guys is that when you go to replace these pads on here, you're going to want to kind of make marks with the marker possibly on your metal here, so you know exactly where that pad's supposed to sit. And I would also do that here. I want to make a little mark on the heat sink just to denote where that pad begins, and of course where that pad ends. Basically, I'm just putting a little mark on it. so when I peel this pad off, I'll know where to put the other one. But just a tip. Here I have replaced all the thermal pads using both 1mm for the outer pads like these, and then on these inner pads here I used 2mm thermal pads. And then I also took a paper towel and I cleaned off the thermal compound paste that was kind of right in this area here. And we're going to do the same thing to the actual GPU. It has some on it, so we're going to take a kind of a paper towel to that. And if it gets really bad, you could also use some isopropyl alcohol and Q-tip or cotton swab or something like that, because it'll evaporate and it shouldn't damage anything. Usually recommend 90% isopropyl alcohol. Been doing this for years, so you can safely get away with doing that. So anyways, I'm gonna go ahead and clean that up, and then we will be ready to put our card back together. For the record, thermal compound or thermal paste shouldn't be conductive, so it's okay if you have a little bit still on things. Like obviously you can see that even with the isopropyl alcohol that I use to clean, it's not perfect. You also see the GPU might have some marks or scratches from your heatsink rubbing on it or whatever. Not a big deal, that's why we use the thermal paste anyways. The fact that it fills in little grooves and tiny micro like lines and things like that helps quite a bit with that thermal paste. It just gives everything a good bond and lets heat transfer occur a lot better. So anyhow, we're gonna go ahead and use Arctic 5, Arctic Silver 5 I guess it is, on the thermal area right here of the GPU. We'll probably put about a pea-sized amount there. We don't want to overdo it. It's easy to overdo it. Less is more on that. So if you use too much, obviously it's going to be a mess and it's just yuck. So try to use a little, maybe a dot, pea-sized dot of it, small pea, and that should get you going. So once you apply the thermal paste, you'll be ready to take your heat sink that you've applied all of your thermal pads to, and you'll want to peel off those plastic things that I mentioned earlier that are still on here. I still have to peel mine off, but I'm going to do that next. And then I'm going to put the card back together with the screws we took out. Let's go ahead and peel off our plastic. Should just kind of work its way off. And we'll have to do that for each one. Let's kind of find the edge and peel it back. Oops, see, that can happen, so you gotta be careful with that. Okay, that's a little sticky. And just find your edges and carefully peel. They don't peel perfect, as you can tell. They're a little sticky under there, but should be good enough to do the job. The last one's a little, there we go, it's coming up. Perfect. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and paste our GPU. So I'm going to go ahead and use some Arctic Silver 5. This stuff comes in like a syringe, basically. It's fairly decent. We're just going to put a pea-sized amount on here, so it doesn't take much. Just got to get this thing off here. There we go. So basically we've got Arctic Silver 5. Try to put a pea-sized amount right in the center of your GPU thermal plate. When I say a pea-sized amount, it doesn't take much. Oops, I probably almost used too much. I'm just trying not to make a big mess. Pea-sized amount doesn't take much, because when you put the back plate back on here, or the heatsink back on, it's going to smash it down and like push all that paste out to the edges, and it'll be pretty smooth, uniform, all that. So the next step we have to take is to put our wires back in, and then we can put this thing back together. So I'm sure that you remember we took out the fan connector and 2 connectors down here. One's a 3-pin, one's a 4-pin. Pretty self-explanatory. Just put them right back where you took them out from. There's a, oops, too much, 3-pin right there and a 4-pin. We'll go ahead and also put the fan one back down in here, but nothing serious. Make sure when you're connecting these to get them down in there really good and tight. Just a 2-hand push, kind of wiggle them back in. They usually clip right in. There's the first one, and then the second one, same thing. We're good to go there. Alright, and then we're going to move on over here and get the fan one next. Kind of lean our car a little bit to get that to go, but shouldn't be no problem. There we go, we got it connected in there pretty good. And now we're ready to put our heat sink back on and screw it back together. So I've just pretty much laid my back plate right over the top of the heat sink, and I made sure that my holes were lined up really well. And next thing I'm going to do is put the screws back in. Well guys, something I've learned here is that these 2mm pads might be a tad bit too thick, or these outer pads are too thin. I did not get good clearance when trying to put, I don't know how I want to put that. I didn't have good contact on these outer pads. In fact, you can't even see where those chips even touched it. So the upper pads clearly have evidence that they were being touched by the stuff. So what I'm thinking of doing next to make this work is to either put smaller pads here and use the 1mm instead of the 2, or replace these with 2mm pads. And I'm just kind of thinking that it might be smarter to put 1mm pads here and see where we are. So I went ahead and I replaced the pad here, here, and here with 1mm pads, and we're gonna see if that goes back together right. The 2.0 or the 2.0mm pads that I had here before, they were not touching the chips over here and stuff, or they weren't kind of even making contact with these ones over here either. So now that we've put thinner pads here, basically, I expect that they'll mount back together, but I will check real quick and let you guys know. All part of the fun in learning how to do this. So I went ahead and checked clearance between the chips and the heat sink. Generally you can see in there that they're making good contacts with the chips. When I haven't put the screws back in yet, but once I do, there's a pad right there that's gonna just get sucked right down and it's gonna make good contact. So before, when we had the 2mm ones where the GPU exactly was sitting, or around that zone, it was too thick. So it is safe to say on these Aorus 6800s that you can just use 1mm through the whole job. So I recommend buying at least 2 packages of it, 3 if you're needing some extra just in case, but 2 will do the job. So I'm going to go ahead and put the screws back in, tighten everything back down, and we'll reinstall it. Alright guys, we're going to go ahead and put our screws in. I've already started. I think the best place to start with putting your screws in is going to be up here near the GPU, so that you can kind of work on tightening that area down first. Your GPU has paste on it, and if you put your 4 screws in first, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe an X pattern, slowly tighten one side, then move in an X pattern, it should suck that back plate, heatsink, and all that together really well, really evenly, and it'll distribute that paste a lot better. But then you can move to your outer, you know, work your way to the outsides, and put one on each side. But I've already put 1 screw here, and I put 1 screw here. I'm moving to here next, and then there. So it's just a matter of putting it back together. And we'll put the, oops, don't want to tighten it too much because I got to do that evenly between all of them. And I'm going to move back over to the first one that I started and kind of get it nice and snug tight. And looks like right there, it's good there. Now I'm going to move in the next pattern to here. Finish that one. Get that good and snug and tight. And I'm going to move to this one. Oh, it's pretty close. And then back over here. And then back over here again. Looks good. Back over here. Alright, and then here. And those are pretty tight. So we're going to go ahead and move to the 3 here. Then we're going to get these 2. And then we'll get the last 2 back here. And here we go. It's 320. And of course I'm gonna put one on the exact opposite side, so I'm gonna skip the middle there. Oops, try not to drop your screwdriver. And then we can go for the middle one. Kind of finessing this so that we don't end up overdoing it, because you can break stuff if you're not careful. And looks like 2 more to go. I'm gonna go out to here now. And put that in there. Alright, and for our last 2 in the very back, they're kind of smaller screws than the rest, so let's finesse them guys too. And the other side. And I think what I'm going to do next, since I've got some thermal paste on my fingers, I'm going to clean my hands, and then I'm going to wipe down my graphics card with probably a washcloth with a little bit of rubbing alcohol, or not rubbing alcohol, use isopropyl alcohol. I'm going to use the isopropyl 91% and wipe it down with a rag, and then we will be ready to install it back into the system. But you'll probably have fingerprints on it like I do right here from the thermal paste, touching it and stuff. But it looks like, if you look down inside between the printed circuit board and the heat sink, I think we have a pretty good, what appears to be a pretty good bond between the thermal pads and the actual chips. So that's what our goal was. I think we're just perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and clean it up, put it back in my system, and fire it up. As you can see, the alcohol has just kind of finished evaporating, and we've got our fingerprints off of it. Looks like all the thermal leftover residue is gone, except for one spot that I totally missed wiping. The thing is still a little bit of alcohol left on there, but yeah, it comes right off with the isopropyl. And also that stuff evaporates pretty easily. You'll see it evaporating right now, and it leaves nothing behind, so it's totally safe for electronics.
Well, that looks to be a little bit better than it was. I'm actually mining right now using the graphics card, and I was having 61 degree Celsius temps, and this thing is now running 42 and 43 degrees. So I would say that's quite a significant difference in temperature between, now we're cranking up to 44, but from 61 to that, 44 even, 45, it's not bad.